Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Crime on the Clarkfork, the true crime podcast where I tell you about big crimes that happen in small places. Each case that I cover has occurred in areas with populations of 15,000 people or less. My name is Mackenzie Spence, and I'm your host. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you are a returning listener, I'm glad you came back for another episode. I know my episodes have been far and few between, and with that, I do want to make an announcement. I am going to be switching from every other week to a monthly podcast release just because I wasn't making a podcast every other week, and it kind of caused me to freeze and not do anything at all, so I'm hoping this will help me kind of feel a little less overwhelmed with the podcast and life and all that kind of stuff. I am recording this the day that it's released, so happy Sunday, September 8th. This morning I woke up and went and cheered on my best friend who ran in a half marathon this morning, so that was really exciting, especially because I wasn't the one that had to run it. But with that being said, let's just get back into this episode. Today we're traveling to the center of the United States, to the state of Nebraska. The sources for this episode are U.S. Census Bureau, Psychology Today, The Cinemanaholic, The Reader, KETV7, Lincoln Journal-Star, Hay and Forage Grower, LA Times, National Organization of Victims of Juvenile Murderers, NBC News, Tribute Archive, Find a Grave, and Justia. Murdock, Nebraska, 2006. Population, 269. It was April 18th, 2006, the morning after Easter, when Andrew Stock arrived at his parents', Sharmon and Wayne Stock's secluded farmhouse in Murdock, Nebraska. It was around 9 a.m. when Andrew arrived and immediately felt as if something was off. His father's newspaper was still sitting on the front porch, and he was not up and around as he usually would have been by that time in the morning. Even so, Andrew went into the house and headed to his father's office to see if he was in there, but he was met with a sight that no child ever wants to see. When Andrew Stock got to the top of the stairs, he found his mother and father dead, both with gunshot wounds. Wayne was laying face down in the hallway in a pool of his own blood. His face was disfigured from a gunshot wound. When Andrew saw his father dead in his home, he ran outside to his truck and called the police. When the police arrived, they entered the house and found Sharmon dead in the bedroom of the home. She was lying between the couple's bed and the wall, and she had also been shot. Both of the Stocks were still in their pajamas and barefoot when they were found. This led investigators to assume that the couple was awoken from their sleep when they were attacked. Sharmon was actually found with the telephone in her hand, which makes many wonder if she was attempting to call for help when she was killed. When the autopsies were complete, it was found that a 12-gauge shotgun had been used to shoot both Wayne and Sharmon. Wayne had been shot in his right eye, once in both knees, and in the back of the head, and Sharmon had only been shot once in the eye. There was no evidence of forced entry to the Stocks' home, but what was found was a window opened with the screen removed in the laundry room. The evidence that the investigators found in the Stocks' home was shotgun ammo, a pipe used for marijuana, a blood spatter pattern that indicated 2 offenders, and a flashlight. A neighbor had also told the investigators that they had seen a tan car speeding around a mile from the couple's home around the time that the murder was thought to have occurred. There were also no valuables missing from the Stocks' home, so burglary was not the intention of the perpetrators. The Stocks were very popular in their small Nebraska community. This led to the patrol investigator, William Lambert, and the Cass County Sheriff's investigator, Earl Schenck Jr., who, by the way, neither had experience with homicide investigations, to have very few suspects in the case. The couple were known for their hay business, spending time with their grandchildren, and spending time outdoors. Sharmon Stock was born to Arthur and Gwyneth Drake on July 25, 1950 in Lincoln, Nebraska. Pretty soon after she graduated from high school, she married the love of her life, Wayne Stock, on August 17, 1968. She was a stay-at-home mom until her youngest child, Andy, went to kindergarten. After all of her children were in school, she took a job as a paraprofessional, which she did for 17 years. Wayne Stock was born on July 4th, 1947, to Willard and Lorene Stock in Murdock, Nebraska. He attended Murdock School and eventually went to Southeast Community College for building construction and served in the Nebraska National Guard. Wayne was a lifelong farmer and the owner of Stock Hay Company. He loved to fish, and he also loved cars. He loved cars so much that he kept his high school car and was in the process of fixing it up when he had passed. He also loved the pond and spending time with his family. When the investigators were grasping at straws to close the homicide case, they narrowed in on the Stock's nephew, Matt Livers, who they had learned from the victim's family members had some history of conflict with the couple around money. Livers is described as immature and having an intellectual disability, which left him with a low IQ. Lambert and Schenk brought Livers in to interrogate him regarding his aunt and uncle's murder. The interrogation lasted 11 hours, during which Livers experienced a high amount of stress. During this 11-hour investigation, Livers was also administered a polygraph test. The person that administered the test was inexperienced with the machine and scored his responses incorrectly, which led them to tell investigators that he had failed the test. When the investigators got this news, they went back to Livers and told him that the only way he wouldn't get the death penalty is if he confessed to the crime immediately. This led Livers to confess to the murder of his family members. Now, it is well known that people with lower IQs are much more likely to provide false confessions when they are stressed and under pressure, especially after hours and hours of interrogation. Unfortunately for Livers, the investigators wanted to close the case as quickly as possible. When the investigators realized that they needed 2 offenders of the murders based on the blood spatter, they brought Livers back to interrogate him about his accomplice in the crime. Again, being stressed and pressured by the investigators, he told them what they wanted to hear. He pulled a name out of thin air and told Lambert and Schenk that his cousin, Nick Sampson, was the second perpetrator of the crime. He told them that he and Nick had planned to murder Wayne and Sharmon, which they acted on the night of April 17th. Once they murdered the couple, they left each other and moved on with their normal lives. With this confession, the investigators were pleased and arrested Livers and Sampson. When they arrested Sampson, the investigators claimed that they were able to retrieve a 12-gauge shotgun and a pair of blood-stained jeans from his home. They were especially content because Nick's brother owned a tan Ford Contour, which just so happened to be cleaned the morning that the murders occurred. Even so, when the car was searched, there was no evidence that linked the car to the crime scene. When it came to Nick's brother, Will, he was also questioned in the murder investigations at the beginning when they learned about the color of his vehicle. 2 days after the murders, the police knocked on Will and his wife Alan's door. Will wasn't home at the time because he was on his way back from Omaha where he was working a construction job, but Alan was home. Alan was too short to see out the peephole on the door, so she was hesitant to open the door, but when the knocking persisted to the point that Alan didn't think the person on the other side was going to leave, she answered the door. She was surprised to see 2 investigators there. The investigators introduced themselves and asked if Will was home. When she told them no, they asked her if she would be willing to answer some questions at the police station. When she agreed, she told them she needed to put on her shoes, and then they asked her if she would be okay with them looking inside her home to make sure that no one else was there. At this point, Alan didn't feel threatened by the investigators because she assumed that they were going to anyone who knew the Stocks to try and find information that may lead to an arrest. Once Alan had her shoes on and the investigators were pleased that there was no one else in the house, they headed outside. As they were walking down the steps of the home, Will arrived. When they explained to Will that they were bringing Alan to the station to answer some questions, he also agreed to help in the investigation, so the investigators took Alan and Will in separate cars to the police station. When they arrived, Will was brought to an interrogation room where the investigators, Schenk and Lambert, asked him questions that mainly focused on his cousin Matt and his brother Nick. They then went on to ask about what he and Alan had done between Sunday and Monday mornings. When it was Alan's turn in the interrogation room, the investigators asked questions about Matt and stocks, similar to what they had asked Will. Both Will and Alan had mentioned that Will had his car detailed in the morning of the murder, which had been prearranged with his friend's brother as a trade for Will giving him rides to work. The interrogation lasted over 2.5 hours, and during that time, Alan and Will gave the investigators permission to search their apartment and both of their cars. When they began looking into Will's vehicle, they called Will and Alan and let them know that there had been a few spots that came up in the testing and they would be keeping the vehicle to look into it more. The couple agreed because they assumed that the spots that showed up would be from a friend who had thrown up in the car a couple of weeks prior, or from a dog that often rode there. The car was tested with luminol, and those tests indicated that there was blood evidence present, but the Douglas County CSI chief advised the investigators that it was a false positive, most likely due to debris that had been transferred into the car from the construction site that Will worked on. The investigators even examined the vacuum bags that had been used when detailing the car, but they came up with no evidence that the vehicle was used in the murders. During the investigation into Matt Livers and Nick Sampson, both had brought up that they had alibis for the time of the crime, but these facts were ignored. Furthermore, Liver recanted his confession, claiming that he only admitted to the crime to satisfy Lambert and Schenk. He stated that he gave answers based on how he thought the investigators wanted him to answer their questions, as well as by pulling information about the case that he had heard from his relatives or the news before his arrest. Even though there was no physical evidence found in Will's car, the investigators called in Kofod, the CSI's lead investigator, who was famous in Nebraska for being able to find evidence that no one else was able to. Kofod went into the car that Livers had said was used to drive to and from the crime, and after 6 hours, he found a single drop of blood that was tied to the crime scene. With this tiny bit of evidence, Livers and Sampson were arrested for the murder of Wayne and Sharmon Stock on Tuesday, April 25th. The police argued that the pair had been plotting the murders via phone calls prior to that Easter day. 2 weeks after the initial questioning of Will and Alan, the pair were woken up at 2:22 a.m. to their cell phones ringing. It was Lambert and Schenk. They tell the couple that they have a search warrant and they're outside the apartment. Alan and Will needed to turn on all the lights in their apartment and come outside with their hands in the air. They are exhausted, but Alan calls her mother, who she says is on her way over. Then, their phones ring again. The investigators ask them what they're doing and where they are. They tell them that they are in the process of turning on all the lights and that they were heading downstairs. When they got to the bottom of their stairs and opened the door, they were met with 8 police officers, guns pointing at them, flashlights, spotlights, and police car lights twirling. They were then handcuffed and taken into their apartment and sat on their couch. The police began trashing their apartment, pulling out drawers, going through boxes, throwing things on the floor as they went. When they were satisfied, they uncuffed the couple, taking Alan's tennis shoes, Will's dress shoes, and a bong. As time went on after this, Will and Alan knew that the police had their phone records and they also were monitoring their calls. But the police were unable to find a connection to Matt Livers, and they also hadn't talked to Nick over the phone for months. At this point, they had also heard rumors that Livers and Sampson had confessed, but they couldn't believe it. Then, in May, the investigators show up again in Will's life, but this time at his place of work. They walked through the worksite, asking multiple people that he worked with where he was. When they found him, they told him that they have a warrant for his DNA and fingerprints, and they put him in handcuffs. The investigators walked him 300 yards, right in front of 50 subcontractors and his bosses that were also on site. The investigators also called Alan to let her know that they had a warrant out for her fingerprints and DNA, and that they think that she knew more than what she had told them. After their DNA and fingerprints brought up no new evidence, they thought they were good to go. And this all happened before Livers and Sampson had even been arrested for the murders. Then, the couple got word that there had been another check of the car, and a speck of Wayne Stock's blood was found. Allen thought that the only way the blood was found was if it was placed there. During all of this, the investigators were still looking through the Stock's home. And during this, a detective found a gold ring that was engraved. It was laying on the kitchen floor, assuming to have fallen off of someone's finger. The engraving on the ring said, "Love always, Corey and Ryan." When asked about the ring, the family of the Stocks confirmed that the ring did not belong to anyone in the family, including Sharmon and Wayne. With this information, the police called the jewelry company, whose name was also found on the ring. It wasn't easy for the jewelry store to find who the ring belonged to, but after some time, they were able to let the police know that the owner was a man named Ryan, who lived in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. The police went to Ryan's home and began questioning him about why his ring was found at the crime scene. He told police that his ring had been left in his truck that had been stolen just a few days prior to the murder. When police looked at the records regarding Ryan's stolen truck, they found that two teenagers, 17-year-old Jessica Reed and her 19-year-old boyfriend, Gregory Fester, were charged with the theft of the vehicle. Jessica Reed was a former cheerleader and honor student. After her parents went through a rough divorce, Jessica attended multiple different schools. She eventually got mixed up in drugs, which is how she met Greg Fester and eventually fell in love with him. At this time, she began missing a lot of school and would be away from her home for extended periods of time. She eventually dropped out of school in the 10th grade, and in 2004 she was put on juvenile probation for theft, and she was detained twice for violating her parole. Due to the violations to her parole, she was placed in the Juvenile Intensive Sanctions Program. Unfortunately, she was placed in custody 6 times between June 2005 and February 2006 for violations of the program, which included theft, criminal damage to property, and possession of drug paraphernalia. According to her caseworker at the time, she was extremely dishonest whenever she had to deal with someone of authority, and she was also intent on ignoring restrictions and sanctions that was placed on her. Gregory Fester also had a criminal history that included hot-wiring cars, trespassing, shoplifting, disorderly conduct, sexual assault, and burglary. He also had a history of substance abuse, including marijuana, alcohol, cocaine, heroin, and dextromethorphan. Through his life, he had also been under various degrees of psychiatric care. Greg and Jessica lived together in Horicon, Wisconsin, where they were out on bail for the crime of stealing Ryan's truck when they were brought in for questioning regarding the murders of Wayne and Sharmon. At first, Jessica denied any involvement in the murders in Nebraska, but once she was shown photos of Livers and Sampson, her story began to change. Greg was also being questioned regarding the murders, and during this, he was shown a photo of Will Sampson. In Greg's rambling interview, he told officers that Will was the one that was the shooter in the murders, but that he had worn surgical gloves to keep his fingerprints off of the weapon. This led to the police pounding on the door of Will's home on the morning of April 19, 2006 that I had talked about earlier. Jessica's new story after seeing the photo of Livers and Sampson, and some coaxing by the investigators, was that she and Greg met Livers and Sampson at a bar in Murdock, Nebraska when they were passing through town. Later into the night, the cousins brought Jessica and Greg to the Stocks' home, where the cousins shot Wayne and Sharmon. Since Jessica had placed her and Greg at the scene of the crime, the police went to work looking into the couple. When they searched their home, they found 3 important pieces of evidence. They found a cigarette box that had shell casings from a 12-gauge shotgun that matched the murder weapon and a letter from Jessica to Greg. They found a stolen shotgun from Ryan, the man whose truck the couple had stolen, and they found a diary entry that Jessica had written that indirectly confessed that she and Greg committed the murders. The diary entry read, and I quote, "I killed someone. He was older. I loved it. I wish I could do it all the time. If Greg doesn't watch it, I'm going to just leave one day and go do it myself." End quote. and the letter that Jessica had left for Greg in the cigarette box in their home read, and I quote, "And this bullet, well, Bunny, it's the only thing left, and I loved it, but that's something we will talk about one day. But it's here also because that was something I did for you, me, and for you to love me as much as I love you." End quote. During this time, when investigators were looking into Jessica and Greg, Nathan Cox, the Cass County District Attorney, was working on dismissing the 2 murder charges that were against Nick Sampson. He argued that up to this point, there was not enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Sampson committed the crime. They also couldn't expect Livers to testify against Sampson because he himself hadn't been sent to trial. Cox went on to promise that his team and law enforcement would continue to hold the people who committed the crimes responsible for what they did, but stuck to the point that Sampson was not a perpetrator. He stated that there were 3 people in custody for the crimes that had occurred and were proceeding to trial, and Cox also assured everyone that he was confident that the state had a case and would be having a successful prosecutions. Livers' trial remained set for January 2007, but due to this, Sampson was able to walk as a free man after 6 months in jail with the charges against him being dropped. When Sampson walked out of the law enforcement center, he ran to the arms of his fiancée. He was also met by his mother, sister, brother Will, and a handful of friends who had been standing behind him since the beginning. His public defender addressed the media after his release, stating that after 5 months and 10 days, the charges against Nick Sampson had been dismissed, and that law enforcement was wrong. He emphasized that Sampson was not guilty in the murder of the Stocks, and that his client had been arrested before any forensic testing had been completed. When forensic testing came back, Sampson was not a hit on any of the results. He went on to say that Sampson had an alibi for the night of the crime that was completely ignored by investigators. There was no evidence that showed Livers and Sampson had made any phone calls leading up to the murders like the police had been saying. They had not even spoken on the phone for more than 4 months prior to the crime. Now, back to Jessica and Greg. Jessica was confronted with the information that the police had found her note and the gun in Greg's home. She admitted to falsely naming Sampson and Livers in the murder. She confessed that she and Greg had stolen Ryan's truck while under the influence of drugs and cough syrup, and they went on a robbing spree. They robbed miscellaneous places across 3 states before stopping at Wayne and Sharmon's home to rob it. Greg entered the first floor through the laundry room window and then went to open the door for Jessica. They didn't stay on the first floor for very long before heading to the second floor of the house. Jessica heard snoring coming from the upstairs bedroom, so she took off her coat to try and not make any noise while she was moving around. What the couple didn't account for was Wayne waking up and confronting them. When he woke up, Greg shot Wayne in the knee, which led to a scuffle for the firearm. During this, Greg told Jessica to do something, which ended in Jessica making direct eye contact with Wayne and shooting him in the eye. When Wayne was shot, he fell forward and Greg jumped on his back, shooting him in the back of the head. After shooting Wayne, the couple went and shot Sharmon in the eye, killing her immediately. When they realized what they did, Jessica and Greg fled the scene, leaving behind a marijuana pipe and a flashlight. In this scuffle, the gold ring found at the crime scene had fallen off Jessica's hand, because she had put it on almost immediately after finding it in the truck that her and Greg had stolen. Based on this confession, Jessica and Greg were arrested and charged with first-degree murder, while the charges against Livers and Sampson were dropped. Greg and Jessica were given the opportunity for a plea deal, and after a lot of deliberation by both people in the couple, they had both decided to plead guilty to second-degree murder. Part of Jessica's plea deal was that she agreed to testify against Greg. Jessica was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences, and Greg was given the same sentence, but was also given an additional 10 to 20 years for the use of a firearm to commit a felony. In 2008, both Greg and Jessica attempted to appeal their sentences, stating that they were too excessive. but the court reaffirmed its original judgment in both cases. At the time of this podcast, Jessica is serving her sentence at the Nebraska Correctional Sentence for Women in York, and Greg is serving his term at the NDCS Reception and Treatment Center in Lincoln, Nebraska. Greg's parole review is set for August 2027, and Jessica's parole hearing is set for October 2031. Now, you may be wondering about the blood that was found in Will Sampson's car. It was actually discovered that Kofid, the man who had found the blood after 6 hours of searching, had planted the evidence that he had claimed to find in the car. Kofid claimed that Wayne's blood ended up in the car because of a sloppy mistake, but the judge didn't believe his excuse, and due to this, he was sentenced to 20 months to 4 years in Lincoln Community Corrections. He was also ordered to pay $6.49 million to Sanders and Livers due to the wrongful imprisonment based on the false evidence. When he was charged with this, Kofid did not respond, but he has said that he has no means to pay on the order. After he was released from jail, he moved from Nebraska to North Carolina. Bill Lambert, one of the investigators, continued to serve as an investigator with the Nebraska State Parole. Earl Schenck Jr., the second investigator, was reassigned to Cass County jail duty. Andy Stock, Wayne and Sharmon's son who found them that Easter morning, has continued his parents' legacy of farming. After their death, Sharmon and Wayne's will was executed. The will stated that all of their assets were to be divided equally among Andy and his 2 siblings. Once Andy turned 30 years old, he took over full control of the farm, and now he works on the land that his parents did, farming alfalfa, corn, and soybeans. He also raises his 2 children on the farm, Haley and Elliot. Sharmon and Wayne's children did an interview with Dateline in October of 2016, talking about how they want their parents to be remembered. They don't want them to be remembered as the couple that were murdered in their bedroom in small-town Nebraska, but rather as people who would give the shirts off their back to help others. They were parents and grandparents who loved their family more than anything and loved spending time outdoors with them, fishing and hunting. So let's remember Wayne and Sharmon Stock in the way their children want them to be, as caring people who would do anything for anyone else. Now, I hope you liked this episode, and as always, please give me 5 stars on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as a review on Apple Podcasts. I'm always looking for cases to cover, so if you have a case suggestion, please visit the link in the show's Instagram page at Crime on the Clarkfork. I also post pictures from the cases that I cover on this Instagram page, so go give that a quick follow and let me know what you thought of this episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will catch you next time with more big crime in small places.